Ladies and gentlemen, namaskar and welcome to another session of the 16th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. We hope you're having a nice Monday morning and are ready and geared up for the next session that we have, Empire, the story of a world-conquering podcast. William Dalrymple and Anita Anand in conversation with B. Rowlatt. The Empire podcast started in August and went straight to #1 and has now more than 1 million downloads every month. That's August last year, of course. Characterized by William Dalrymple and Anita Anand's easy camaraderie and contrasting personas, the podcast looks at how the empires rise and why they fall and how they have shaped the world around us today. In discussion with B. Rowlatt, Dalrymple and Anand discuss why people everywhere are suddenly so interested in the business of the empire. Our first speaker today is one of the festival co-directors himself. William Dalrymple is the author of the Wolfson Prize-winning White Mughals, Duff Cooper Prize-winning The Last Mughal, and the Hemingway and Kapuscinski Prize-winning Return of a King. His book, The Anarchy, was shortlisted for the Duke of Wellington Medal, the Tata Book of the Year, and the Historical Writers Association Award, and won the 2020 Arthur Ross Medal from the US Council of Foreign Relations. He's also a member of several Royal Societies, thank you so much for that, sir, and has held visiting lectureships at Princeton, Brown, and Oxford, where he's currently an Honorary Bodleian Fellow. He was also presented with the President's Medal by the British Academy and was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers for 2020 by Prospect magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, William Dalrymple. Our second speaker today is his co-presenter for the podcast, Anita Anand. She's an award-winning radio and television journalist, and she's also the author of books like Sophia, Princess Suffragette, Revolutionary, Kohinoor, The History of the World's Most Infamous Diamond, and The Patient Assassin, for which she won the Penn Hessel Tiltman Award for History Book of the Year. And as you all know, she also presents the Empire podcast with William Dalrymple. Our moderator today is B. Rowlatt, a writer and journalist. Her award-winning travelogue, In Search of Mary, was a biography of the year. And she's now writing a novel about a girl who can't stop stealing. And we hope you steal some ideas about your podcast in this session. Ladies and gentlemen, Empire, the story of a world-conquering podcast. Thank you.
Good morning, JLF. How are you today?
Yes!
Welcome to Empire, the podcast that conquered the world. See what they did there?
Out of the cage she springs.
Oh, God, he's interrupting me already.
I know, shush.
And so is she. Have you got any idea what a challenge this is to try and rein these two in? So, prepare to have your ears and your hearts colonized by these conquerors. Anita Anand and William Dalrymple. Friends of the podcast will know what just happened there.
Yeah.
It's just a baby podcast. It's only 5 months old.
Barely.
I want to go back to its conception, if that's not too creepy, of your joint baby. Anita, tell us how it came about.
Well, so we worked on a book together, which is also an accidental book that happened, which is the Kohinoor Diamond. So Willie had...
born at the Jaipur Literature Festival.
It was born here, yes. And gosh, you're the mummy and daddy of our careers together, actually. So we were in the green room, and we both come to talk about our own respective books. Return of the King, and I was talking about Sophia, and glinting in the backgrounds of both of these books that we'd done was this little Kohinoor Diamond story. And so I know he'll try and take credit, but I said, why don't we do a book about this? But then I promptly forgot I'd said it and did nothing about it. And he rang up 2 months later and said, why don't we work together? I've got a publisher. And I was astonished, and we did. And it was such a fruitful relationship. And the thing about working together is that he makes me laugh a lot.
There was one incredibly embarrassing moment on the book tour when we were all staying at the same hotel in Mumbai on the way to the Mumbai Literary Festival.
Yeah.
And I was with Anita, Olive was there, and Bridge Keenan was
yes.
there. And you know those hotel five-star hotel breakfast rooms in the morning, completely silent, with the noise of coffee cups on saucers and the rip of croissant in the background, or the frizzle of dosa in this case. Anita turns up, and within 2 minutes, Olive and I are both rolling around on the ground, laughing, and making a complete scene in this previously quiet and peaceful breakfast room.
Basically, we can never go back there. That's the main headline of the story. But we just we had a good friendship, and it's a friendship based on a lot of laughter, but also a lot of respect, because we
shared interests.
Interested in the same things, but also love learning from each other. So the Empire
could have led to another book, but it led instead to
Empire. So my career is in radio. I work for radio and TV, and I present. But then you were a guest on another very famous podcast, weren't you? That's what happened.
So one of the more sort of unlikely developments in the last year, really, in Britain, has been the fact that in a podcast chart, usually dominated by sort of podcasts called "I Shagged My Boss" or something, that
or I murdered my boss.
I always wondered how you got a job on this festival, Willie.
It's sex and murder, does very well.
Sex and murder, this sort of thing.
Yeah.
3 podcasts have risen to the top, and they've all been from the same stable. And that stable, rather surprisingly, is founded and owned by the Britain's top footballer, Gary Lineker, who has, on top of his career in football, a remarkable broadcasting career. And he kicked off, first of all, I think, with Tom Holland's brother, James, who did a podcast on the Second World War. Then, crucially, Tom Holland came in with Dominic Sambrook to found The Rest is History, that is now literally the top podcast in almost every English-speaking country in the world. And I went on that podcast, and partly because, as you know, anything in India just involves vast figures. And Indian authors sell more books. Indian people that write about India have larger Twitter followings. For that reason, both podcasts I went on to an Empire were, at the time, much their highest downloaded things.
No, it's because you are good, actually, and also he was out of control. Let me tell you. So they found it very difficult to discipline William, who quite possibly turned the half-hour podcast into 3-hour podcast. But it had such a huge response of love and affection. Well, I don't know. You guys aren't familiar with Fenton the dog. How can you explain Fenton the dog? There was a little viral video that went around of a poor man trying to control his dog in Richmond Park, which just didn't listen to him, was running, and all you hear is this poor man going, "Fenton, Fenton!" And that's what they did on the podcast with William.
And then a whole herd of deer being chased by this dog in the distance.
Yeah.
How does this lead to your podcast? So you
Because
appear on...
when I careered off on my own telling this story, Tom Holland was saying, "This is just like Fenton the dog. He won't obey any command."
Yeah. So then the company came to you and they said, "Look, would you like to do a podcast because you're good? And would you like to do it with somebody?"
And literally 2 days before, I'd had dinner with Anita in her very nice pub in her street.
Yeah.
And I'd spent the whole of the drive back thinking through the things she'd said and laughing at all the jokes that I'd missed, the punchlines that I hadn't got at the time.
Very sweet.
And I remember thinking, if I ever was to be asked to do a podcast, I know exactly who I'd be doing it with. So this request came 2 days later, and I suggested her name instantly that I was asked. And it turned out that the producer, Jack Davenport, had worked with her in Radio 5, and Anita was his favourite broadcaster in the world.
Sweet. That's very sweet.
And she is astonishingly good and quick and
All
brilliant.
right. Let's stop the love. I want to get to awkward places. I want to get to awkward places. And I know that the producer, Callum, is right here.
Oh,
there
poor
he is.
Long-suffering. He's
so
a husk
I'm going
of
to
a
ask you
man.
questions, and then I'm going to look at Callum to see whether he's going, "No, that's not true." I want to know about the editorial process. So you started on home turf, subjects that you've both written loads of books around. So it started in The Familiar, and in season 2 you've moved elsewhere.
Hang on, the first one,
No, I've got to
first one we
move
did
us on.
was...
We don't have a huge amount of time. Talk us through the editorial process, the decisions in where you're going to go, what happens with the research, etc.
Just so quickly, the first thing we tried to do, of course, was Koh-i-Noor, because we'd done it before. And it was meant to be a one-part podcast. But because the two of us just
Can't shut up.
can't shut up, it
Yeah.
ended on going on for 4 hours, and we ended up splitting it into 4 episodes.
But the point is, we don't have 4 hours now,
No.
so that's why.
So to answer your
Director's
actual
privilege.
question is we decided that the territory that we were both passionate about, and also that there seemed to be a hunger for in Great Britain, because there's this thing, I'm sure you may have heard of it, called the culture wars, where it's become quite difficult and contentious to discuss stuff that happened. So it was the Indian side which we started with, and we decided to go right back to the beginning. So in a way, both of us sort of have a half and half speciality. He's the early part of the British's arrival, and mine is the latter part. So right from the East India Company, we thought, wouldn't it be great if we actually had, rather than just separate different subjects, took you on a trip right from the very moment the British twinkled here all the way to when they left and partition happened. So that was quite ambitious, but that's what we did. And as far as sort of planning each episode, I mean, I'd like to say there's a lot of structure and thought that goes into it, but we have a chat.
And somehow it just goes awry.
And we just sort of have a chat in the middle of the week that these are the things that we think are interesting, and we get through about half of those when we actually sit down to record. Nothing is scripted.
Come on, what
nothing.
about fact-checking research?
Oh no, we do a lot of work. We do a lot of work. We want to make sure that we're right.
So you do that beforehand?
Yeah,
and
there's a
have
lot of work.
notes?
It's like I've said to somebody, it's like doing a Viva every week. So you sort of feel like, I mean, and I'm thrilled because I was a swotty, geeky girl. So I get to be a swotty, geeky girl all the time. But you're doing a lot of work as well, which is,
Unusual.
unusual. I was gonna say, you said it, but it's a true story. You are knuckling down, and we're learning things that we're now out of our comfort zone because we're doing the Ottomans, and that's been a
It's very
huge
interesting
speed thing.
because you start off talking about stuff you obviously know very well, and we're now in territory which is fascinating, but we know less well, and obviously it takes more work, and there's more margin of error if you get it wrong. But the key thing, in a sense, the logs to cling on to amid the wreckage is this extraordinary roster of historians who've come to the Jaipur Literature Festival. And over the 15 years of this festival and other festivals, JLF now has branches in Adelaide, in Boulder, in New York, in Toronto. I've seen on stage most of the world's great historians. And not all the great historians, of course, or not all great writers can talk. But we now have a pretty good idea of those that can and those that can't. So we have a really good list of the great talkers out there who are also great scholars, and we've just rung them up.
Yeah.
And no one has yet. Has anyone said? No one said no.
No one said no. But the doing the work is really very serious. It's taken over. Both of us are struggling to write books at the same time. And if my
the
publishers
books
are
have-
here, I'm very sorry. I am very late. But this has kind of taken on a life of its own. And it is like the most fabulous relay race where two of you are running together, so it's not so lonely. You're not going to fall back and humiliate yourself, so you can sort of push each other along. But you just keep passing the baton. And I like to think actually we're taking part in a very important conversation that needs to be had about the kind of the
And that's
the
important.
theory.
I just want to put this in
Yeah.
context. In the British context, the government just last week announced the appointment of an anti-woke czar, according to the Daily Mail, which is someone who presumably's job it is to stop people being mean about the British Empire. So I'm wondering if that's going to reverb back onto you.
So I think the background that will
It
surprise.
speaks to the climate of
Yeah.
conflict and division that you
I don't
mentioned
think
earlier.
people in India have the slightest conception how little the British people know about their own empire. It's not on the curriculum, astonishingly. Anita said, quite rightly, at school she learnt about the Roman Empire,
the Tudors.
the
Yeah, I know. I can tell you about an aqueduct. I could draw you a Tudor beam, but we really didn't do
And
something
it's
as recent as empire history.
And it's not just the elephant in the room, it's this enormous mammoth. And the British also peddled this line, which is reflected in the statements of government ministers and in the national understanding of itself, that Britain was the home of freedom, that it was a place that invented democracy, that brought liberation to the world. And so the version of history they get is that Britain liberated the slaves, but they're not talking about the slave trade. They would talk about how it saved the world from the Nazis and Napoleon, but we don't talk about our own empire. And so the people out there genuinely believe that this is a country which brought freedom and democracy and liberal values everywhere it went, rather than the much more bloody, complicated story of genocides, wiping out of entire peoples, the export of capitalism, industrializing the slave trade from something which had existed almost everywhere in the globe, but something which suddenly became much larger, much crueler,
I think you're definitely right with a certain generation, but I do think that it's an intergenerational thing, and that young people are much more aware.
Well,
and just as a really
not
small
taught it
example,
at
I took
school.
my kids last month to see the Tollywood movie. Are any South Indians in the house? Yes. Natu. Dance off later. And there's a scene where, I mean, it was a largely white young audience. I'm sorry? Everybody watched, including a bunch of young white kids in a packed cinema in London, and they cheered and cheered. And the biggest cheer is when, the arch-villain, Scott Buxton's blood is splashed across a sign that says the sun never sets on the English Empire.
Right.
Everyone went nuts for it.
Well, I mean,
I've been listening to your
our podcast is not as covered in mire and gore, but also I don't think it's as controversial. So in the background, you're absolutely right. There is this political wrestling match going on about what should and should not be said. And we actually just think it's a lot simpler than that. I mean, I wanted to subtitle our podcast Stuff That Happened. It's just not, this stuff happened. It is not up for political debate. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. You can argue about the rights and wrongs, but there are some incontrovertible facts, and we would like to give those to you. So we somehow, I think, bypass the culture war, or we haven't signed up for it. I mean, I want no part in it, but I do very much want to tell people, actually, this is stuff that happened, and then it's up to you to do what you want with it.
And equally important, I think, is to slay myths when they are myths on the other side. For example, there's a widespread belief in this country, frequently figured in the language and the mythology of the freedom movement, that the British cut off the thumbs of the weavers of Bengal. You find it frequently referred to. Now, there's actually a very interesting story behind that doesn't actually, it's no better, but it's not true in the form that it's told. The story about the thumbs originates in a book written by a man called William Bolts. William Bolts was an enemy of Robert Clive and got expelled from India and his business wrecked when Clive got rid of him and expelled him back to Britain. He took revenge by being the whistleblower, the first man to write about a book about what the East India Company had done, and it's full of very important stuff. But it is the work of a man who had an axe to grind and was going out to destroy someone. And it's not necessarily a book that can be taken at face value. You've got to read it carefully, and you've got to look for other sources to verify what he said.
I think it's an excellent example there that we're trying to slay dragons on both sides. That
But
wherever there is nonsense, we try
So
and deal with that.
what he says, and this is where the story of the thumbs originates, is not the story that it became the myth in the 19th century, that the British cut off the thumbs of weavers so that Manchester cottons and things could be imported to an India that had no weavers. That's the version that went out. What he says, because in those days, Manchester cottons did not exist because the Industrial Revolution had not yet happened. What he says is that the British used to impound weavers in what were effectively weaving concentration camps, and that they had to weave massive amounts in a certain week or a certain month under pressure, and that the weavers were so utterly miserable in this enforced regime that they cut their own thumbs off so they couldn't weave, so they could get out of these corrals. Now that may or may not be a true story, because Bolts is not an accurate source, but that's where that story begins. And we know that it wasn't true because there were no Manchester cottons until about 40 or 50 years later, and the British hadn't even got to the stage of being able to import cloth to this country. They were there to buy Indian cloth, and so common sense tells you that it's not a true story, as well as the historical. So it's very important, as well as cutting down the myths on one side and educating people about the horrors of empire, to be very careful about the facts. and not to allow other pernicious facts on the other side to cloud clear, calm assessment of what actually did happen and what didn't.
Returning to the theme of empire and the sort of elasticity of that term, in the Anarchy, you compare East India Company to the transnational corporations like Amazon. And we've actually witnessed in recent years, we are all now fully colonized in a sort of bloodless takeover by Elon Musk. Can you take the concept of empire further away from the treatment that you've done so far into areas like this?
Well, I met somebody in the green room who said, actually, you should start doing virtual empires because people need to know how, digital technology is colonizing not just minds. It starts with the pocket. And actually, that is one thing that it has in common with all the empires that we study. It starts with the profit motive each and every time. And then it goes to the minds, and very rarely does it care about hearts and minds. Hearts get left out. So, it's something we haven't considered, but it's something that we might. But at the moment, we're having tremendous fun just picking where to go next. So the Ottomans, I think, have been another fabulously sort of misrepresented period in history. This idea of a sort of and it's because of, the winner writes the history, right? So, most of the films, they're sort of savages with scimitars, and it doesn't get much further than that. And we have, in the process of doing, this present run that we're in, uncovered just such a rich, interesting, and contemporarily important history. You can see why, so many of the fissures in modern politics stem right from those ancient roots.
So we're still about halfway through this series, and in a sense we're still telling the stories of the heights of Ottoman rule. Where we're heading next is absolutely fascinating because it's in the conquest of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, when, among others, Indian sepoys brought up from Suez. Allenby has Rajasthani cavalry when he takes the Ottoman army on outside Ashkelon. There are people from Jaipur, Jodhpur fighting these wars. Other people from outside my house in Delhi. There's a plaque in Mehrauli saying, in memorial of the 1,200 people of Badapur and Mehrauli who lost their lives in the First World War. They weren't in the trenches. They were in Kut, in Basra, and Indians fought those battles. Now, what happens when the British Empire and the French bring down the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War is you get the birth, just like in this country, partition laid the dragon's teeth, which has reaped all the hostility between India and Pakistan that still exists 75 years later, and which bedevils politics all over this region to this day. In the same way, what happened with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire gives forth all the horrors, in a sense, that still bedevil the Middle East. So you get Palestine and Israel. The fight, Palestine is promised to the Arabs and to the Jews by the British. And so when the First World War breaks out, you have this, at the end of the Second War, you have the Balfour Declaration, which makes this statement that Palestine should be a Jewish homeland which will in no way endanger the rights of the indigenous people. Now that's an impossible promise to make. Yeah. And as we know, the Palestinians have been pushed back and back into smaller and smaller enclaves, and it's become an Israeli state with a dominant, now nationalist Israeli government. That's one story. Greece and Turkey, that's a second. The genocide of the Armenians and the leftover of the Armenians. The fact that the Kurds haven't got a homeland and they're being bombed in Syria this week. The fact that there's an issue about the caliphate and what happens to the caliphate, ISIS. That goes back to this. And so one after another of these stories comes from this history, which if you don't know it, you can't understand what's happening.
Exactly.
And then the Saudis. Ibn Saud comes out of the end of the First World War, again with sort of not resisted by the British, not helped. And so the birth of Saudi Arabia, and with it, the birth of Wahhabi, not the birth, but the propagation with oil revenues of a particular form of Wahhabi Islam, which had then been marginal and which now is, in a sense, the norm, and which is a far more orthodox, far more hardline type of type of Islam than the type which was dominant here, which was very Sufi, and extremely different in its.
So this political hinterland is very much closer than people might think. Is that why people are turning to the podcast? How do you explain this?
So it's astonishing because when we started it off, it was largely because we very much enjoy each other's company, and it was a kind of an excuse to be geeky and nerdy together in a really fun way. And we thought, it'll have a limited run, it will have a limited appeal, especially because, there are people in the past when, I've presented them the opportunity to do something on Empire who've said, there's no appetite for this. So we started off with
and they only commissioned 10 episodes to begin with.
Limited expectation, but this thing went mad.
Blown up.
I can't tell you, we started in the second week of August, and this lovely company that we work with just said we've never seen an exponential rise like this in listeners. And it started off very much that we had a very British audience and people writing into us, much as I said to William, that I didn't know this. Why didn't we know this? This is only as far back as the First World War, and we have parades for that. Why don't we get told this? And suddenly the word started spreading, and suddenly we noticed, about 2 months in, it started becoming more and more international. So we have a very great and growing audience from Australia and New Zealand, America, because these are themes that are universally interesting. It may not... Things like, for example, we just recently done an episode on coffee. And front and center in this coffee episode, and why, we all love coffee. But, the place where coffee, one of the richest places in the world at the time was in Yemen, a place called Mocha, which was exporting the very first beans, and you look at that and you frame it with the modern day pictures of the place. You need the context, and you need to have that context to be sufficiently responsive and intelligent especially when it comes to decisions about the world around you. Important people in particular could benefit.
So you've heard what she said. The second this ends, you need to all get on your phones and download it right away. Are we about to hit a massive major milestone by any chance?
We're about to tip over 5 million, which is just ridiculous, Which is for a history podcast about empire. Yeah. Which is an awkward, thorny, difficultly shaped, that works for a podcast, not in writing, but, awkwardly shaped subject is extraordinary. And we're thrilled.
Talking of awkward, what do you argue about? And I'm going to be watching Callum's face to see what do you argue about and who wins?
She does.
I mean,
wise.
I tell you, we don't argue about much, except he's like, Doctor Who doesn't have to obey the laws of time. This is the new incarnation. It just has. It's not on purpose. He just has no idea how it works. So I'm there like some kind of bionic Mary Poppins with my umbrella. Come on, chip chop. Let's get on with it. But that's fun. But we don't tend to argue. We've not fallen out. We haven't fallen out about anything.
Willie, are you ever guilty, for example, of becoming intoxicated by the exuberance of your own verbosity? Ever, perhaps. Does that happen? I don't know.
Can you imagine?
Could that happen? I don't know. Next awkward question is, and this is something I don't understand. We're literature festivals, we rarely talk about money and the lack of it. Basically, most writers are skint because there's just no money in it. Are you suddenly wealthy since August?
Yeah, the drinks are on him.
No, but seriously, how does it make money?
There is commercial sense in doing a podcast. If you, that's not the reason to do it, and that's not the reason I think that we did it. We did it for the interest and just to see what would happen, and because we both had a feeling, and we've been toiling in the same field where certain people say there's no interest, and we know there is. We just feel it that there is. So that's why we went into it, but it hasn't hurt. The money hasn't hurt.
And our sister podcasts, which are The Rest is Politics and The Rest is History, which literally are number 1, number 2, and number 3 in the British podcast charts.
So how much money does it make?
Are significant winners.
How rich are you? We want to know. Do we want to know?
Just might
5 million downloads. How does that translate?
Go and ask Tom Holland, who's on the next stage.
Tom or Willie?
Might find the flowing
everybody's
verbosity
downloading it for
up.
free as a business model.
So the business model is sponsorship, and the business model is commercials, and that's
how
it works.
Your cheeky adverts.
Yeah.
So, Anita, because she works for the BBC, says I can't read adverts.
I can't endorse
it. So I have to do the hard work on the adverts.
Yeah. Yeah, no. So William does you actually do a very beautiful voiceover now.
So then,
well done.
the advertising revenue goes to the podcast.
So
the main company.
It's split 3 ways. Company gets a third, he gets a third, I get a third. So it's very clean in that way. It's sort of it's enormously democratic. And there's also a speed that appeals to me. You know, there's a craftsmanship. We've both worked for organisations that spend a lot of time making things beautiful. There is something down and dirty and punchy about doing this, which actually appeals to another part of my psyche. Obviously, I had no idea I was so punchy like this. But there is some purity of having an idea, sitting down, having a chat, can we do this idea? Him reaching into his little black book and saying, I know exactly the right person we should get on, and then just doing it.
It's quite quick turnaround. You can just make it happen.
Turnaround. Yeah, no, I know. It's pretty much
Callum
recorded as live.
edits very quickly.
Yeah, Callum, there's a poor beleaguered man in the white T-shirt. Please go and buy him a drink or give him a hug. Because for him, I think dealing with the two of us is like herding cats on a daily basis.
I can see the trauma in his eyes,
poor
actually.
Man. I know. We're all saving up for a therapist for him, but, you know, we're very grateful, Callum. Thank you very much.
And you've banked a whole load of recordings whilst you were here. Can you tell us anything about what's coming down the pipeline?
I'm so excited for you to hear this new series. So, yeah, no, that's really, I'm so excited that you brought it up because it's blown me away. So the next one we're doing is not strictly the beginning, birth and end of the dominance of a country, but an idea of slavery. So we're starting right from the beginning of ancient slavery, because, you know, there is a lot of, you know, why do you always talk about the transatlantic slave? What about, you know, the ancient slavers? And we thought, okay, you know what about that? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about all of those different types of slavery.
We've recorded, while we've been here, David Wengrow, who was sitting in this seat yesterday, on the origins of inequality, because this whole question of, you know, was early man running around hunting animals, and before agriculture, before cities, was there equality then?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I subtitle that in my head as, are humans just bastards? Which is that just what we're like? So that's a really interesting.
So it's very interesting. You have, from the very beginning, signs of inequality and signs of slavery and capture of human beings. You also have societies which had slavery, which ended it. So the idea that there's one emancipation is false. There are also, there's a myth out there which David has taken on, that the big moment of the growth of inequality in societies is when you get agriculture. Agriculture in turn leads to the ability to have settlements, which grow into cities, and with cities come the first rulers and kings and emperors. So you get the pyramids, you get the ziggurat of Ur. But there is great evidence, and David writes about it in his fabulous book, The Dawn of Everything, that there are other societies which are very egalitarian, notably the Indus Valley civilization, where everyone's houses are exactly the same size. Everyone has plumbing. And so it isn't true that all societies are inherently unequal. There are variations. Human beings have these choices that they can make. We can form the societies that we want. It's a very interesting philosophical start.
It's a choice. I mean, that thing is that, you know, we aren't inherently bastards is the answer, but do listen to the podcast. There are choices to be made. But also there are, you know, things that I love this challenge that this series has presented. So, you know, there is often this belief, particularly in England, that, you know, Wilberforce and emancipation was like a light that went on. A light goes on and go forth, you are free. And we've talked to Chris Manjaripa.
Which is exactly what happens in the movie Wilberforce,
right,
where Benedict Cumberbatch releases people from slavery, and there's huge cheer in the House of Commons, and everyone bursts into tears, and the slaves are free.
But the truth is different.
It didn't happen.
Is nutty and gnarly and long, and the fact that actually, you know, you could be told that you're emancipated, but then you have to do 14 years of unpaid indentured labour afterwards, and you're not allowed to go back to your families. And it is a semantic change of whether you are free as a slave or as an indentured labour. I mean, are there either of those things true? So all of these things are stored up in this slavery series, bringing us right up to date, and actually also to the shores of India. But wait and see.
I'm really excited.
One of the
for
things
that
which
season.
I didn't know, which we heard yesterday from Chris,
Go on.
and this is a very important thing for you guys to know, is that the number of slaves moved from Ethiopia and the east coast of Africa to India is the same as the number of slaves moved in the transatlantic slave trade to the Caribbean. And we're now going to be doing, because there's a huge, they're called here the Habshis. And if you look at the courts of Awadh or the Deccan, there are these extraordinary, both slave, the existence of slaves, but also in the Deccan, rulers who came from slave backgrounds, the most famous of which is Malik Umbar, who took on the Mughals, fought Jahangir, and who developed the guerrilla tactics that Shivaji and the Marathas then used against the Mughals 2 generations later.
May I point out one more thing? Apart from the timing thing, he doesn't get suspense. So I literally just said, and we come to the shores of India, but you'll have to watch this space. He does it all the time in the podcast.
He just leaps in, didn't he?
I always do this.
A good story.
I do this beautifully crafted, and you'll find out apparently in the next nanosecond because he can't sit on a story. He doesn't understand suspense.
But it's also very much the nature of the podcast that you find one extraordinary thing and then it leads you off in a whole new direction. So it's actually very hard to stay on track, as I'm finding out, trying to kind of rein you two in.
You're feeling a little Callum's pain. Sorry,
So
B.
podcasts are absolutely huge in the US. They're blowing up in the UK. What's it like here in India? People downloading you?
Well, it's funny. It reminds me of that sort of time when digital TV was about to take off. And I sort of get the impression that the podcasts are just at that very sweet point where people are starting to get it and starting to understand that you can carry the world in your pocket. So, I mean, it is all available to you. And we are growing, but you're quite a young market. But I think, just as with that digital time when everything suddenly, once there was just a Doordarshan and then you woke up like Rapunzel the next day, not Rapunzel, Sleeping Beauty, and the next day there's 60
I remember watching
million of
MTV
these
for the
things.
first time here. They put on U2, The Fly from... and there was this first time I'd ever seen a music video in India.
But it happens quickly. So I think here, the number of you lovely people, and we're so grateful, honestly, who've come up and said, we love Empire and we love this about Empire. But this is still a very new market.
Do not hesitate to get tuning in. I spoke to your alleged rival. I nobbled Tom Holland of, the other podcast in your stable.
Yeah, the place that dare not
speak its name. And I tried to get him to be indiscreet. I tried to say, rivalry, and he was just way too gentlemanly and he wouldn't partake in any of that. But he has consistently pointed out an absence in your podcast, and it is the absence of Marilyn Monroe. And if you wish to adjust that now, I may be able to help with that.
Well, you have something?
May I?
Yes.
It's actually very little known. I mean, people know that Marilyn Monroe, the actor, was a great supporter of literature, not just because she was married to Arthur Miller, but she was also a keen advocate of the limerick art form.
Oh.
So if I may, this is one from Marilyn Monroe, which is, I think, very themed to Jaipur Literature Festival.
Sitting on the edge of my seat.
There was an old fellow named Sidney who drank till he ruined a kidney. It shriveled and shrank, and he drank. But he sure had fun doing it, didn't he? So surely you're in the lead now in the Monroe-ometer, if nothing else.
Take that, Tom Holland.
On a completely random note, I'm going to ask if there's any questions from the floor. I'm sure there's tons, yes. Microphone people, can you zoom in really quickly so we don't waste our wonderful speaker's time? Yes, yellow sleeve waving. Can't see everybody.
Hello.
Keep your hands up, please, everybody else.
My question is after these podcasts are coming up, do you think the books will be lesser as compared to the modern the version that are coming up?
Quite the opposite. It's a massive boost to book sales. Everyone that's been on the show, and everyone we've mentioned, including dead authors, have seen a huge spike internationally in sales.
I think Williams single-handedly resurrected the career of Stephen Runciman. But also, remember that there is a limitation with a podcast, which is time. We only have that hour in your pocket. And we're hoping we're giving you a roadmap to go find out more things. So books will actually do much better out of this form, I think.
Hi. Great talk. I'm so excited to go listen to the podcast. But I was going to ask, do you have a lot of guests or historians from the places that you talk about? So, for example, and what do you think that contributes to the conversation? Why do you think it's important?
Well, I think it's huge. So, for example, with the India one, we had Ramachandra Guha talking about Gandhi, who is utterly fascinating and dealt with some of the knobbly issues and thorny issues about Gandhi and his reputation, and how actually here Gandhi is more of a contentious figure now than he is in Britain. In Britain, he is simply venerated.
We're just beginning to put up statues to Gandhi.
Yeah,
in
we
Britain.
put statues in Westminster, you know, and here you have statues of Netaji going up. So we talk about that with him. We have Ayşe Jalal, who talks about Jinnah. We have a number of Turkish historians on the Ottomans. So you're absolutely right. It's really important to hear the voices from those places, and we'll make a huge effort to do that.
We talked a lot about how the British people don't know the story of their empire. One of the most surprising reactions to me, certainly, was when we put out Ayşe Jalal on Jinnah. And not just you guys, but also the British via the movie Gandhi have an incredibly one-dimensional version of Jinnah as this villain. I will break India or I will destroy it. This sort of stuff. And he's, you know, and he's this sinister villain in the story. To have a Pakistani, in a sense, give the other side of the story, amazed millions of listeners here in India.
Yeah.
And we got a whole postbag of emails saying, I didn't know any of that. For example, the moment that Jinnah, early in the 1930s, criticizes Gandhi for bringing religion into politics, but when he starts having prayers at political meetings. Now, I've sort of, you know, seen those lovely images
We need to
in
get
the movies.
some more questions in, so I
Yeah,
want to
okay.
speed you on a bit. But I love the sort of reciprocity of the responses that you get and the huge responses. We've got a question here on the front, and then this fella here. Do you want to just do two? And there's a guy at the back. Please, can you get a microphone to waving man? Yes.
My question is very short. Mr. Dalrymple, what happened to the descendants of the Habshis in India?
Still around in some places. There's a very large community, not in India, but in Pakistan, in Karachi. But you find them, for example, if you go south of Bombay, there's what used to be a Habshi kingdom, Janjira, run by descendants of black African slaves who ended up becoming military slaves, then military generals. And 2 years ago, I went from Janjira, from the coast to the island and back again, and everyone in that area of the coast was clearly had African genes. There were also, interestingly, baobab trees, which you never see anywhere else in India, which had been imported from Africa on the coast. But there's a very good book by a guy called Kenneth Robbins called The Black Slaves of Africa, if anyone wants to research this further. There's a whole history. And they rose, this is where Islamic slavery is interesting and complicated.
Here we go. You have to,
No, it is worth saying. It's worth
There's
saying.
another one here.
There is
There's
this
another one
ability in Islamic slavery to
Interrupt him.
rise
Jump up
to
and
become
get
a
in.
general. So if you think of the slave kings of Delhi, Qutb-ud-din Aibak, they were slaves who rose to be sultans.
Congratulations on a wonderful podcast. I love both of you. You are both of my heroes.
Oh,
So,
we think you're great too.
thank you. My question is on Sir Hugh Hamilton Dalrymple. You know, you keep giving anecdotes about him, you know, a little bit of this, little bit of that. And I was very intrigued when I heard the podcast about the picture of him you found after he passed away in the Rashtrapati Bhavan.
Yeah.
So, you know, is there any lead towards it? You know, can we do another podcast just on him
Oh
and
my
his
God!
adventures?
That one podcast isn't enough on his family. If you are already listeners to the podcast, he's related to everybody. I keep going home to my mum and saying, "What the hell were you people doing?" So seriously, all I can tell them is like what my chachi said, and he's like, "Oh yes, well when he ran Bengal stroke India stroke." Anyway, yeah,
Even
about this
Virginia
portrait,
Woolf.
it's
So this-
infuriating.
This is my dad, who was here at partition and was inadvertently in the middle of all the drama of partition, and he wouldn't talk about it. I lived here for 30 years, tried to persuade him to come, and I think because of all the things he saw and the bloodshed he witnessed and those trains coming in with blood gushing out of him, with dead bodies, that he saw all that, and he never came here, and he wouldn't talk about it. And I, over and over and over again, got out microphones. He wouldn't. I could never persuade him. But it was my son Sam, who's sitting over here, who the night before his funeral went into his room and got out his scrapbooks. And there was him in Mehrauli, where I live, looking at the Qutb Minar. There was him in Rashtrapati Bhavan at the Mountbattens as a young ADC, aged 18, not invited because he was a grandee, but just because he was part of the staff of the grandees and was filling out the table. There he was, 2 down from Gandhi, opposite Jinnah, next to Mrs. Jinnah. All these people, I spent my life reading about, and he'd met them. He lived in Teen Murti House, now the Nehru Memorial Museum. He lived also later in the story in Command House in Rawalpindi, where General Musharraf and the ran Pakistan from.
Jumping in again, sorry.
One final bit, though, extraordinary story. And he
is impossible, isn't he?
You need to say Fenton,
his
otherwise
boss-
it doesn't work.
Okay, Fenton,
His boss
Fenton.
It doesn't work.
After partition, the British kept command of both the Indian and the Pakistani armies for a period. And they had to get rid of these guys, the Pakistanis, in order to invade Kashmir. So my father let loose, without his boss, borrowed the staff car, which was called, I think, Rawalpindi 1, and drove what was then just 2 hours to Srinagar, where he went off on holiday with his friend, aged 18. He came back to find that there'd been this invasion, that the border had changed, that nuns in Baramulla had been raped, there was an airlift of soldiers into Srinagar, and he couldn't get back to his office. So a journey that had taken 2 hours on the way out, he had to jump into a transport plane to Delhi, get on a night 4-day train to Bombay across the desert, get a flying boat to Karachi, and then get a train up the broken train network of Pakistan, again with all these partition trains going backwards and forwards. And it took him 3 months to get back again from a thing that took 2 hours on the way
It's taking us
out.
3 months to get to the next question, which is this. And this is our last question, so make it a good one, short, spicy, to the point.
Hello, sir. Hello, ma'am. And I love you guys. Your podcast is amazing. I really love listening about Ottoman Empire, the rise and the fall. My question is just that in the age of colonization, when Spain and Portugal went to Americas and colonized this, why Ottomans can't do it? They were present in Indian Oceans and they were fighting the Portuguese there. So why can't they just go to the Americas? They have the navy. They could have colonized, but I think that they were having competition with Spain and Portugal. So that's why, but I want to know the reasons.
So India did have colonies, or certainly had massive influence. This is the book I'm writing at the moment, The Golden Road. Part of it is the story of the Cholas, for example, who colonized and invaded and burnt the temples and looted the temples of Sri Lanka. And you get the Sri Lankan chronicles saying exactly the same sort of thing that Indian chronicles later say, both about the slave sultans coming in, but also when the British come, the looting. That happens by the Cholas. They raid Sumatra. They raid the coast of Malaysia. There are many examples in history of raid, but there were never. And then there were large numbers of Indian settlers, particularly Brahmins, going out to Southeast Asia, which is why, in the end, you get the largest Hindu temple in the world built in Cambodia, not in India, which is Angkor Wat. So it's a whole interesting history. But you're right, there was never a colonial empire in this part of the world in the same way that the East India Company, for example.
But I also just wanted to thank you for the question. And also, you know what, this is a podcast where we are also... The brilliant thing about podcasts is we are often led by you. So, we love to hear questions from people who are listening, and sometimes they're very, very personal. It's like someone will just say, what happened to my great-grandfather? And it will immediately sort of spring out into a deep and lovely story. So and hopefully, I don't know if this slide is up, but how you can actually find us. We're on Spotify, we're on whatever your major platforms are here. Just go look for us.
We just have to squeeze in one last very quick question for the gentleman standing on the side here. Can you bring a mic swiftly over here? Thank you. No, because it's being broadcast as well, so please wait for the mic.
First is the statement. All you three guys would make much more money as stand-up comedians.
I think that's a compliment.
Thank you.
But William, last week, and this concerns your dad, I discovered a trunk, 2 or 3 trunkfuls of photographs of somebody who must have been with your dad in Teen Murti House. He was ADC to Auchinleck, and then the commander of the bodyguard with Mountbatten. So I'm sure his period and yours overlap. I'm going to take Sam there to see the photographs. We may be able to catalog them. and your dad may
Fantastic.
figure in them.
He was ADC to a guy called Frank Messervy, but he knew Auchinleck, and Auchinleck was very much around.
Did you find any of my nani? No. Okay. No, that's fine. Okay. Just checking. Just checking. Okay.
What about my mum? Feeling left out.
Okay.
Everybody, download this podcast. You're in for such a treat. It's brilliant. Also, buy their books. Are you both signing books?
Sure, happy
now? Is
to.
this
Happy
happening?
to, and happy to
Yes.
chat more, yeah.
Huge applause, please, everybody, for the amazing empire
you,
with
B.
Wigan and
Thank
me.
you, B. Oh, amazing.
That one indeed felt like a podcast on stage. Thank you to William Dalrymple, Anita Anand, and B. Rowlatt. And as she said, both of them will be signing books at the bookstall on my right, so please do form orderly queues. And next up at the front lawn, we have Culture, the Story of Us, from cave art to K-pop. At Charbagh, we have The Road to the Country, in the words of Chigozi Obiyama. In the Mughal tent, we have Somewhere Among the Stars, and also Among the Mughal tent. At Darbar Hall, we have The Immortal King Rao, and at Bethak, we have Jaipur Dreamscapes, Sheher aur Sapne. We hope to see you at the next session, and do not forget to tag us on Twitter at Jaipur Lit Fest, and follow us on YouTube, again, at Jaipur Lit Fest. And if you are tagging us, do also use the hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival. Thank you, and see you at the next session.
There